Hey everybody, thanks for joining us today for our webinar on building a GRC program for multiple compliance frameworks. My name is Kendall Morris and I'll be hosting us today. I did want to let you know that in the GoToWebinar panel, you should have a section for handouts. I believe there's one there already, and as we go through the webinar, we'll probably be adding a couple other things in there as well. There's also a chat section. Feel free to drop any questions in there. We'll be monitoring the chat, and we have some time set aside at the end just to answer any questions that you have. We'll also be dropping some links to resources in there. For now, though, I'll turn it over to Christian to get us started.
Thanks, Kendall. Hey, everybody. A couple admin items as we go through, like Kendall mentioned. Please throw something in the chat. Love to answer questions as we go. We'll do a Q&A at the end. I gave Kendall a lot of resources, so throughout this talk today, I'll reference links or white papers, things like that, tools, and Kendall or myself will throw them in the chat, so check that out. If you're watching this on YouTube later, we'll put them all in the description, so you can check them out in the description of this video or the comments, and I'll dive into it. So very excited about today. We're going to talk about a problem that I think if you're on the security side of the house or if you're on the GRC side of the house trying to build out compliance programs will be very important to you. And that's really how to build a risk management program, especially in the context if you're an individual trying to build a risk management program to comply with multiple compliance frameworks. So if your organization is dealing with ISO, SOC 2, PCI, NIST, alphabet soup of different requirements, what should your risk management look like to be effective from a compliance perspective, but also do the right thing for the organization from a security perspective? If you do not know me, I'm the CEO and co-founder of Risk 360. Risk 360, we kind of have four sides of our business. So we help organizations get certifications. So the alphabet soup of different certifications like SOC 2, ISO, PCI, HITRUST, etc. We also help organizations implement those same programs where we're not the auditor, we're actually the consultant, and we have playbooks to implement all of those different frameworks and help you be successful on the other end. And then we also do managed programs. So if you have a small team, you're short-staffed, or you have no team at all, and you're trying to build out a GRC team, you need someone to come do that for you on your behalf. We do that for organizations, and then we also do pen testing of an offensive security practice. The reason all of this matters to you is I think I can add an interesting perspective because not only are we auditing these risk management programs for multi-framework programs, we're also building them for organizations. So we have both the auditor's perspective, but also the builder and maintainer's perspective. And as we go through this series and today's talk, I'll try to provide some insight from both perspectives so you have that. Also, if this is the first time you're joining us, this is a four-part series. This is part number 3 of a multi-part series for if you are trying to implement a multi-framework strategy at your organization. We already talked about governance structure for that purposes. Last time we talked about how to do policies that are fit for multi-framework, and today we're going to talk about risk management. And then later in November, I'll talk about mapping controls, opportunities for automations, and some of that. So please stay plugged into us on LinkedIn, YouTube. We publish all of those. We also have the prior 2 parts of this series on YouTube. So if you're watching this on YouTube, go check out those last 2. And it's a nice little series that'll give you a whole strategy for implementing a multi-framework strategy for a compliance program. So when it comes to risk management, let me give you a little bit of background. So why should you even be listening to me? Why do I know anything about multi-framework programs? Why do I know about risk management programs? So for the last 7 years, I've helped organizations build those programs, literally hundreds of them. We built a playbook for doing this, a step-by-step process. We've been through hundreds of external audits, internal audits, presented to the board of directors. And what I've tried to do in today's talk is distill what we've seen be successful in terms of a risk management program down to a process that you can interpret and then go and implement on your own. So I'm hoping that all of these lessons learned that we have will equate to something that you can take and make actionable. So that's a little bit of the history. Let me talk about the challenge. So what's our objective for today? So John is a theoretical client at Software Corp, and he's a GRC program manager. His particular program is ISO 27001, SOC 2, PCI, he has other regulatory requirements, and he's really having trouble. He wants to build a risk management program that meets those requirements, but isn't just a compliance check the box, is also helping the organization manage risk. I know a lot of you can empathize with that. A lot of us have been in those shoes. And you have to manage multiple frameworks. So there's unique risk management or risk assessment requirements you're trying to interpret. Even when you do a risk assessment, often leadership doesn't take you seriously, or they don't know which risk they should actually prioritize. I've seen organizations who are tracking risk in different spreadsheets and different tools. They're all over the place, so there's no central view of those risks. And you do risk assessments, and there's a lot of frustration that sometimes stuff doesn't happen. There's no action driven by the risk assessments that you're doing. So I know a lot of you are probably nodding your head right now. You've been there, I have been there, and we want to put a system together that will help solve John's problems here. So we'll talk a little bit about that. That'll be our goals for the day. Just real quick as we go through this, I wanted to point out if you're kind of looking for the specific clauses, if John's managing his program, where are these requirements coming from? In John's particular program, we mentioned SOC 2, ISO 27001, and PCI. So those are the clauses. So SOC 2 has them all over the place. There's CC3, risk assessment, CC9, risk mitigation, ISO 27001, and their information security management system, there's clauses 9 and 8. PCI has requirement 12. But even if you look at HIPAA, there's HIPAA risk analysis, NIST has it all over it, risk assessment. All the frameworks require risk assessment and risk management. And they're using different words to say the same thing, but the technique I'm going to show you today will help you accomplish and meet the spirit of all of those requirements. So this is a framework agnostic process, but it will meet the requirements of all of those different frameworks. And so it'll solve John's problem. So when it comes to risk management, we're going to talk about 4 things today. I'm going to talk about something I like to call the Information Risk Council. That's the governing body of a risk management program. Sometimes it's called a Security Risk Council or a Cybersecurity Council, whatever you want to call it. At Risk 360, we call it the IRC or the Information Risk Council. I'll talk a little bit about that. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about how to do a risk assessment. I'm going to point you to some great resources and show you a couple of those live. I'll talk about tracking risk and a risk register so you can actually prioritize, risk rank, do risk analysis. I'll show you an example. And then we're going to talk about project management of those risks. So once you identify risk, how do you actually do something about them to reduce risk so they're not just ethereal? Great, you've identified a risk. Now let's go do something about them and drive organizational change. So there's some lofty goals for today, but that's where we're going. We're going to start with the Information Risk Council. So what I see with risk management programs is often the risk assessment is delegated to a GRC manager, or it lives in the security team, or it lives in the compliance team, but there's no place for the risk to go for decisioning. So there's not a forum to make decisions, to allocate budget to those, to drive action, to mobilize the organization to make things happen. There lacks authority because often you might identify risk that also takes IT buy-in. You might have to get budget from finance. So there's no place to make this decision. There's also different vocabulary. So maybe you're using words like high risk, or you're assigning a numerical score to it, or you're just saying high priority, low priority. So no singular vocabulary. And then you don't have a system to do it. A system meaning a process, but also a technology to drive all of this. And that's where the IRC can help you out. And an IRC is a forum where you can get cross-functional members of that organization, like members of IT, members of security, your GRC team, whoever else you deem applicable. You can establish a formal charter for that to give them authority and oversight of those functions. And once you identify a risk, you have a place for those to be processed. So I'm going to give you a couple things to think about. So one, an effective IRC needs to have an IRC charter. So a charter is the formal document that will document the roles and responsibilities of the IRC. It also gives them authority to act and make decisions. I think a lot of times what we do is we form a committee, but it's only an informal committee in the sense that we've agreed to have a meeting on a periodic basis, but the executive leadership team hasn't blessed that team to act with authority, to apply budget, to make decisions. And by putting together an IRC charter, what you're doing is you're forcing the hand of leadership to formally delegate that responsibility to that set of individuals. And that's a huge step and an often misstep I see in organizations, where you go through the really hard work of finding the right people, getting them on the team, but you didn't formally charter them or get top level leadership's buy-in to let them act. So take that step. I also think it's a really good idea to make the IRC cross-functional in nature. I kind of alluded to that earlier, so you'll have to think a little bit about who are the best individuals to be part of that group. Definitely someone from GRC, top level leadership from security are great people. I've seen individuals from legal, I've seen information technology be part of that committee, but think in your own organization. If you're a really large organization, maybe it needs to be the C-level or director level. If you're a small startup, maybe it's just your founders, but think about who the right individuals at your organization are to be a member of the IRC, and then make sure they buy in on it. So just really important to charter that, get buy-in, make sure everyone understands their goals. I don't want to beat this point up too long, but it's just one of those steps that seems obvious, but the organizational change to make this happen effectively is something you have to take a lot of care to do, especially if you're a GRC analyst or someone who's tasked with the duties, but you don't have the authority to make things happen. You have to go through and influence the organization to get these people to be part of a group so that you can make some progress in the organization. Once you have an IRC set, that's when you need to start thinking about the cadence of accountability. So what I often recommend for an information risk council is a quarterly meeting basis. I've also seen a monthly meeting cadence be pretty effective. And you really want to think about, you want to create a designated time and space for those people to think about risk. So you're probably doing a lot of prep work. You're probably preparing an agenda, a slide deck. You're shortlisting the items that that team needs to make decisions on. But the bottom line is, whether it's quarterly or monthly, you're creating that place for them to make those decisions, and you're standardizing information channels. And what I mean by standardizing information channels is that rather than everything being handled over email or a side conversation or through a Slack channel, you're creating a space where you have those formal discussions. And the point of that meeting is to knowledge share, but also drive decisions. A very important component of a risk management program. I see that missing often. Talked about the meeting cadence. A couple of things I just want to mention, because again, what I often see is a program that has an informal information risk council. Then they agree to meet periodically, but those meetings become not productive. So people start to, I think, get cynical about the nature of those meetings. And then eventually the whole thing just crumbles and the organization stops having an RC at all. So one of the most effective ways I've seen to prevent that is to have really good meetings. And a couple of tips I'll throw out there is one, consider strongly your meetings before the meetings. And what I mean by that is, ahead of the IRC meeting, who do you need to talk to? What things do you need to socialize? What opinions do you need to get? Do you need to identify a champion ahead of the meeting so that they're supporting you during the meeting? And that will set you up for success during the meeting itself. So do not underestimate the effort and the time and the level of strategy it takes to influence that organization and to have a successful meeting. Also, obviously, you have to prepare and circulate read ahead materials like your slide deck, maybe any data for that particular meeting. And then you need to have an effective presentation. So if you're looking for presentation materials, we have some templates available. If you're already a Risk 360 customer, which I know a lot of people watching this are, and you're in our platform, Phalanx GRC, we have in our policy section example charters, example meeting agendas, etc. So definitely check those out. And you can also go to our website and look at white papers, and we have a lot of really good templates for presenting to a board of directors or presenting to an information risk council. So just go to risk360.com/whitepaper and then look for those templates, and you can download those if you're looking. And Kendall, you can throw those in the chat and put them in the description of the YouTube video if you're watching this on YouTube. So that is the information risk council. You have to have that. Then the second piece of this whole system is doing a risk assessment. And that's a lot of times where people want to start. They want to start by doing the risk assessment, and that's kind of a fun activity. You uncover risk. And there's a lot of questions about, well, how do you actually do that? So we're going to talk a little bit about it. So let me start by talking about a nuance. So what is a risk assessment versus a controls gap assessment? Because a lot of times people put use those two words interchangeably. So maybe you want to do a security gap assessment. And what a security gap assessment is you take a framework, let's say you take ISO 27001 or SOC 2 or NIST, and you identify a control and you say, is that control in place or not in place? So I have information security policies, might be the control. Is that a gap or no gap? So that's a gap assessment. That is not a risk assessment. A risk assessment is looking at the organization and thinking about the nature of the threats and your vulnerabilities and how those could manifest into risks. So for example, I might say, hey, I'm a healthcare tech company. I have a SaaS application. That data collects healthcare data. So there's certain types of risk facing my organization because I'm doing that activity. What are those risks? So that's the difference between a gap assessment and a risk assessment. And we're going to talk about how to do that risk assessment, because ultimately that'll help you prioritize security investments, because you'll be more clear on the things that you need to protect and why you need to protect them. It's also a compliance requirement. We've talked about that. You have to do a risk assessment. So we'll talk about the compliance elements of that. And ultimately, you want to get everybody on the same page. So one of the biggest frustrations I see at organizations is they can't get the security investment they need to appropriately secure their company. And one of the reasons they can't do that is because they can't articulate the risk and the reward for that investment. So taking my example of the healthcare tech company, if you go to an executive and you say, hey, we need to do a pen test because SOC 2 or ISO requires us to. That's one conversation. Maybe the CEO at that point would probably say something like, well, get the cheapest pen test you can get because we just want to compliance check the box. A second way to approach that same conversation might be, hey, we have mission critical data on this web app that is highly targeted by threat actors, and we're seeing this kind of traffic attempts to access that web app. Therefore, I would really like to get a robust pen test, uncover gaps so we can prevent a security breach. And by the way, if we have a security breach, it's going to cost us millions of dollars in reputation damage. Well, in that case, the CEO is much more likely to give you the resources you need. And a well-written and executed risk assessment will help give you the talking points you need to have that kind of conversation. So I want to talk, I can't dive too deep on the how behind how do you do a risk assessment, but I want to provide a couple tips. One, and you can see this in the description of the YouTube video, and Ken will throw it in here. I did a whole LinkedIn post on this where I created a simple guide for how to do a risk assessment. So definitely recommend checking that out. It's just a really good process for simplifying how to do a risk assessment. But at a high level, there's a few good techniques I think you should consider. So one thing to do is just read everything you can. Read all prior security reports, read your annual report, your annual 10K, read your risk register, prior risk assessments, prior pen test reports. Just read everything that you can get your hands on at the organization, product roadmaps, etc. And that will give you a lot of context, and you'll probably be able to uncover risk directly from that. The second thing that I would recommend is consider doing surveys of your organization. So for example, maybe you want to send out surveys to your engineering team. Maybe you want to send out questionnaires to the executive team and collect demographic information or get their opinion on different topics. Sometimes that's a very efficient way to get information on a lot of different or a lot of opinions from a lot of different type of people in a very efficient manner. So consider that. Lastly, I'll talk about doing interviews. Interviews are a really good way to get some face-to-face time. They take a little bit more time, but you can ask pointed questions and just get that top-down feedback. So maybe you want to meet with the CISO and just ask a blanket question. What do you think our biggest risks are? What are the big projects we're working on this year? What have you seen historically? What type of things are you worried about in the industry? Document those, get them there. Two other things I'll mention is big projects. So ask your company how they're spending money this year. Maybe there's a big ERP implementation, maybe there's a new product that you're bringing to market, but if you understand those big projects, there's probably risk associated with those projects, and that'll help you drive a risk assessment. And then of course, your asset inventory. And what that means is what digital assets do you have out there, like servers, data, technology, communications, everything else. And based on those types of assets, what threats might exist against those, and document those in the risk register. So at a very high level, that was a 5-minute pitch of how to do a risk assessment. Consider some of that stuff, and then download this guide, and that will help you. So let me talk about some quick references that I think will help. If you want to dive deeper into how to do a risk assessment. So one thing I'll throw out there is ISO 27005. That's paid, but it's a good standard for doing a risk assessment. CIS, I love Center for Internet Security. They have a lot of great resources. CIS risk assessment method is great. NIST 830 is a great standard out there. And there's also the MITRE ATT&CK framework. And if you've never seen MITRE ATT&CK framework, it's so good that I want to quickly show you some of it. MITRE ATT&CK framework is a framework that helps you think through threat actors, really the attack path a threat actor would take, and then the types of controls and mitigating measures you could have in place to prevent those things. So if you're doing a risk assessment, and let's say that one of your biggest risk, you're thinking about ransomware, well, you can see how an attack actor would do reconnaissance, then they would do resource development, they would get initial access. Once they have initial access, they would execute on that, etc. And MITRE walks you through the techniques that they do to fulfill that method. And then you can expand this, see what mitigating measures that you could take, what you could do to mitigate those risks from those types of techniques. It's just an absolutely wonderful tool. So if you want to do a little bit deeper exercise on an asset by asset basis and think through how those risks could manifest, I highly recommend MITRE ATT&CK framework. All right, let me hop back in here. All right, so that's risk assessment. So I'm going to operate off the assumption that you've now done a risk assessment. As a result of that risk assessment, you've uncovered a lot of great risks, sometimes hundreds of them, and you need to do something with those risks. So what do you do with them? So one, you need, what I see often happen when it comes to doing a great risk assessment is you don't have any place to put the risks. You've put them in a report or you've put them in a spreadsheet, and that spreadsheet lives in a OneDrive or a SharePoint site or a Google Drive or wherever it might live, but no one ever looks at it and no one ever does anything about it. The other problem I see is, maybe you need others' input on how to even prioritize that risk. You've uncovered this theoretical risk, but you don't know if it's high risk, low risk. You need some perspective on it. You also need an agreement on how to even talk about the risk. Like, how do you risk rank it at all? And then I see that it's almost always in Excel. And Excel has all the classic Excel problems like version control. You can't collaborate very well in it. There's 15 different Excel documents and risk registers floating all over the organization. So those are all problems. So how do you fix some of those? And I'm going to talk through some of those. So I'm going to talk you through how to do a risk register. I do want to show you Phalanx, which is Risk360's in-house risk register tool. And even if you don't want to use Phalanx, I think it's conceptually what you would want to use or build for yourself, even if it's an Excel spreadsheet somewhere else. And I'll talk about how you can prioritize those and prioritize risk, a risk ranking formula based on ISO 27005 and NIST. And then we'll talk about reporting on that stuff and then the appropriate way to actually document a risk at all. So when I think about a risk register, 3 things that I think are worth walking through. One is, how do you actually document a risk? Because there is a way to do that appropriately. How do you score risks and prioritize them? And I want to give you some tools and techniques to think about when it comes to sharing risks with the greater team and driving some action. So first of all, let me talk a little bit about documenting a risk. We have a consulting company here at Risk360. So one of the things that I train the team on most often, or one of the pitfalls I see our team fall in, is how they document a risk. And often they'll document a risk and it just looks like a gap. And we'll do the example here. So they might say every employee has access to a laptop, and as a result, endpoint devices represent the largest attack surface for the organization. That's a cause. Or they might even say gap, laptops don't have hardening, don't have endpoint device management on them. So they'll kind of document it like a gap. And I know what they're trying to say, and I understand the risk they're trying to uncover, but it's not the complete picture. It's not a good risk statement. So if you look at NIST or you look at MITRE has a good example here that I'm doing. They give you a 3-step process to document a risk. So because a risk isn't a gap is only part of it. So how I recommend doing it is you say, what is the cause, and give some context around it. And if something happens, then there is a consequence, because every risk has to have a consequence. So to use our endpoint device management here, we might say the context is every employee has access to a laptop, and as a result, endpoint devices represent the largest attack surface for the organization. All right, that's the cause. If endpoints are not appropriately inventoried and secured, then endpoints could be exploited by malicious actors and used as an attack vector for the company data and resources. So this is an example of a risk statement versus a gap statement. So if you're writing your own risk statements, I think this is just a really simple, easy formula to follow to write a good risk statement. So that's the first thing, documenting them. Document your risk statements like this. The second thing is, once you have that risk statement documented, how do you prioritize it? And the widely accepted formula for prioritizing a risk is thinking about impact and likelihood. And impact is how significant would it be if that event happened, and likelihood is how likely is it that that event will happen. And what you can do is you rank each of those 1 through 5, and you get a risk score. So if impact is 5, likelihood is 5, then you have extreme risk as a 25. That's the most risky thing you could have. So it's almost certain to occur, and it would have a catastrophic impact to your organization. I want to recommend 2 other things, and that is considering cost and effort. I think those are a great overlay to a risk statement, because you might find that you have some things that are moderate in risk but cost nothing and are very easy to fix. And I call that low-hanging fruit. It's a risk that you can easily mitigate with almost no time or cost. Conversely, you might have something that is more low risk but be extremely expensive to fix, and the organization probably shouldn't spend their time and resources trying to correct that. So it's just a really good overlay of that, and I'll show you an example here in a second how you can do that. So speaking of, let me hop into the example of this employee laptop. What I want to do is I want to pull up Phalanx and show you how you can do that in our risk register. Again, this is our tool at Risk 360 that we've developed, but you could use an Excel spreadsheet to do this. I don't recommend that, but conceptually, no matter what tool you're using, I think these principles still apply. So let me go in here. So we're going to add a new item. I'm going to categorize it around, it was asset management. I'm going to do a really shorthanded write-up here so you don't have to watch me, but maybe the risk statement is lots of laptops, if compromised, then breach happens. So quick summary of what I just said. I'm going to not fill out all of these other fields. We have all of these fields because they're very important data. Actually, many of these fields are required for compliance requirements like ISO 27001, but for now I won't fill them out. So a lot of laptops, if the laptops are compromised, then a breach happens. So let's create that. That's down here, a lot of laptops. So now we have to think about, what is the impact? If a laptop is compromised, how big of a deal is that? And if you hover over these, there's some definitions. I'm going to say, if a laptop's compromised, it would be kind of minimally, it wouldn't be nothing, but it'd be minimally impactful. How likely is it that a laptop is compromised? Well, we have endpoint device management. We have a lot of different things going on, so we're pretty covered here. I feel good that we have a moderate amount of protection, but I know it's really common in the industry, so maybe I'll give it a 3. How much would it cost to fix that? Well, I'd have to roll out MDM to my whole organization, so let's just say it's a 3. Effort, moderate amount of difficulty. And you can see now my risk score over here is a 6. So I've gone through that and thought about it. And what am I going to do about that? Well, I'm going to choose to mitigate that risk, which means I'm going to solve it. And so far it's not started. So I'm just going to put on track, but we haven't started. So that's an example of what you could do to risk rank a risk. Other things you would want to do is document the owner. So if I open this up, make it clear who owns that thing, what they're going to do about it, get a solicit. So maybe if John owns this, so we'll go down here and talk about who owns it. John owns this risk. I would reach out to John and say, hey, John, what are you going to do about this? And he's going to put in a management action plan and say, I will install endpoint device management on all laptops. We'll save that. So that's kind of a workflow. And then once you have all of these documented, they're assigned, you can collaborate people to fix them, you can risk rank them. That's how a risk register should work. Good example here for you. Let me hop back into my presentation. So just consider that as you're building out your risk register. Now the question comes, is like, once I've filled out this whole, I've done a risk assessment, I have documented my risk, I've put them in a risk register, I have documented what my risk is, I've risk ranked them and prioritized them, I've assigned an owner, I've reached out to the owner, I've gotten an action plan from the owner, they've told me what they're going to do about it. Now great. Now the key is I have to track all of this stuff. Somebody has to track all of this stuff from a project management perspective, meaning they have to go make sure that John actually does what he said he would do and install endpoint device management tools on all of the laptops. So what is the system to do that and report it up? Talked about those challenges. So what I think you need to do is design really a feedback loop, a project management system. You can do that in a risk register, or you can do that in a project management tool, but the bottom line is you need a designated place to track all of those risks and all the projects that result from the risk. So you have that risk statement. Now the project is roll out endpoint device management to all of the laptops. That's the discrete project to manage that risk. You need to prioritize and have a reporting structure for those projects. And then you ultimately need all of that data in a reportable format so that you can know how well are things going when it comes to tracking risk and projects to resolve those risks. Phalanx has something called the project management module. It's integrated right with the risk register. I'm going to show you that so you can conceptually understand what you need to do. But no matter what at your organization, just know that once you do the risk assessment, once you've documented the risk in a risk register, you have to have a process to do something about those risks. So some of the things that I'll recommend is number one, you need to convert those risks into projects. So to reiterate my example, we had a risk around laptops being an attack surface that could be exploited. We created a project to implement mobile device management across all laptops to limit that risk. And we need to know how high to prioritize that project. And then we need to set up a cadence of accountability to know where John is in the project process of mitigating that risk. This is where I see things fall apart all the time. Let me give you an explicit example. Let's say that you're doing an ISO 27001 or a SOC 2 program implementation. You came in, you did a risk assessment. Based on that risk assessment, you see that laptops is a big risk for the organization, is also a control gap for SOC 2 and ISO, where you need to install mobile device management. You know that you have a due date, or you have a certification timeline where you need to get certified by the end of the year. You know that John has to install mobile device management on all those laptops before the end of the year to pass the audit. Then you get to the audit and you find out, well, John never made that a priority. He never made progress towards installing mobile device management on all the laptops. Now I have missed my compliance deadline, and that can be very frustrating for a GRC program manager or for a security program manager, because ultimately they were relying on someone like IT, who they don't have authority over, to help meet the compliance and the security objective. So this is where that project management element is huge in how it correlates and integrates to your risk management program. I think every project work stream needs a due date, so a desired end state. It needs an owner. You need to set priority, and you need to track the status. I'm going to show you exactly, no matter if you're doing this in Asana, if you're doing this in a dedicated project management tool, if you have a project management office, if you're doing in Excel, whatever you're doing, it needs those things. So think about them as columns on a spreadsheet if you need to. We have this in Phalanx. Again, I'll show you in a second how we do it. And the second thing you need is a cadence of accountability. So once you document all of these projects, how often are you going to meet and get updates on them? Are they going to send you push updates and a status report? Are you going to meet weekly to talk about it? What's the meeting agenda going to look like, etc. So let me tell you how we do it at Risk 360 and what I've seen be very effective. So what I have seen be very effective when it comes to managing projects for risks is to set up a bi-weekly meeting cadence. So meaning every 2 weeks. And then during that meeting, you have everyone roll up your project statuses in advance in a tool or even in a spreadsheet and during the meeting, the actual meeting cadence itself, the only thing that they're doing during that meeting cadence is saying on track or off track. If they're on track, you can move on from that item. If they're off track, then they have to explain why it's off track and then talk about what they're going to do to get back on track. And then your job as a project manager or your project management team is following up in between meetings to track those down and get them back on track. So one of the things we do at Risk 360 is we do these managed programs where maybe a company wants to get ISO certified or get a SOC 2 report, and they need to build the whole program or they need to build a multi-framework program. And we'll do the risk assessment, we'll do the gap assessment, we'll uncover all the projects, but a big piece of what we do is that bi-weekly meeting where we're holding people accountable to on track, off track. And if something's really off track, we're escalating that to decision makers so that they can apply pressure and get things back on track for the organization. If you're doing that for your own organization, you need to identify the people and players that can help make that happen. So don't underestimate the power of those cadence meetings. And if you're stalled already, because I know a lot of GRC people get stalled, maybe it's one of those things. You don't have a project manager, you don't have a cadence of accountability, you don't have a way to track, you don't have owners assigned, you don't have hard due dates, you don't have people telling you if they're on track or off track, and any of that kind of stuff could be the reason that your project's failing or falling behind. So consider some of those variables and do your own self-assessment and see if that might help you. I'm going to give you another quick example of how we specifically do it so you can see what this could look like and you can visualize it for yourself. So in Phalanx, we have a module called the project management module. And I already have these built out for you here, but you can see an effort to accomplish the mission that we just talked about to implement mobile device management on all laptops, we broke it up into two things. One, we have to inventory all the laptops. Two, we have to install MDM on all the laptops. So inventory them, then install MDM on them. You can see here that we've assigned due dates. We know how critical it is. In this case, this is an extremely important step, and we're tracking status on track, off track. One of the really cool things I like is the Gantt chart view. So if I want to get a sense for how much time is this going to take, when are things supposed to be executed, it's a nice view. Sometimes I'll take a screenshot of this to put it in the status update or whatever it might look like. But just a really cool overlay. So no matter what you're doing, again, if you're using Microsoft Project or Asana or whatever you're using, you need to do the same thing in principle or engage your project management office to take your risk, break them out into projects, assign owners, levels of effort, priority, and get them accomplished. But this is a very important and key element of your overall risk management program. One of the most common gaps I see when we're doing audits is that there is an IRC, they've done a risk assessment, they even have a rudimentary risk register, but then when I go through the risk register, there has been almost no action taken to resolve any of those risks. And that is very frustrating because it results in an audit gap, but even more importantly, the GRC and the security team feel very disenfranchised because they couldn't make the headway on those important risks that they would like to. So just consider carefully for yourself, how you can get traction on your program. So that is the overall risk management system. You have your Information Risk Council, that's the governing body. You do a risk assessment. The results of those risk assessments go in your risk register where you're prioritizing and ranking. And then everything in that risk register is broken out into projects, and the projects are tracked to remediation that ultimately reduce your risk. And you can report all of that to your Information Risk Council, and you can get buy-in from your Information Risk Council. This is the system. This is a ton of work. This is a lot of, it's simple, but very hard to implement. A lot of work that you need to do to meet the spirit of these compliance requirements and do right by your organization to reduce risk, but a very simple 4-part system that you need to do to implement that. So I hope that was helpful. This is part 3 of our series, risk management. Up next is something I'm really excited about coming in November to complete our single framework strategy series. And I'm going to talk about across frameworks, how do you map controls for the different frameworks. So if you're doing SOC 2, ISO, PCI, etc., what's a good way to map controls so that you can have some assurance that you're have coverage in terms of all of your compliance requirements, but also that you're getting efficiency. You're not treating every single control framework as a separate framework that's causing rework, audit fatigue, etc. So we'll talk about that piece of it. And then I'm also going to show some really good examples of opportunities to automate your compliance program, to gather evidence, to get higher assurance. I'll show you in Phalanx some of the things we're doing around cloud automations so that you can see what that looks like, but I'll also point you to some things like the CIS benchmarks and some other tools that are out there that just present some really cool opportunities for your organization that I think you should know about. In the meantime, one thing I want to leave you with before we take questions is we do have a white paper. It's called the Single Framework Strategy. It is a great overview of the business case for implementing a single framework strategy if you're an organization that has multiple compliance requirements, a huge audit burden, multi-product. It gives you the business case on why you should do that, as well as a step-by-step process of how you can go about considering that. So if you're trying to implement a single framework strategy for your own organization, it'll give you the words that you need to say to leadership so that they can understand what you're trying to accomplish. And it'll also give you a framework to begin that journey for yourself. Kendall will throw that link into the chat, and it's also in the YouTube description. If you want to check out our tool Phalanx, it's www.phalanxgrc.com. You can actually sign up for a free trial and you can play around with all the stuff that I just showed you. I think it's an excellent tool. We have hundreds of organizations using it. We use it ourselves to do all of our work. We're also ISO 27001, 22301, and 27701 certified ourselves. So we have a lot of empathy. Not only do we build and audit programs, we have a program that is audited, and we use our own platform to manage that program. So if you want to try that platform out, you can visit there and try it out and get a free trial. But I'll pause here. Kendall, maybe we can open it up for questions. So if anyone has questions, I welcome those and be happy to answer them.
Yeah, absolutely. Feel free, everyone, drop some questions there in the GoToWebinar control panel. We did have a few get submitted, so we can go ahead and go through those here, Christian. First one was, how do the requirements for risk assessments differ between common frameworks such as SOC 2, ISO 27001, PCI?
Yep, that's a great question. So I think one downside of the risk assessment and the risk management requirements between frameworks is that some of the frameworks are much more open-ended than others. So if you take something like SOC 2 or ISO 27001, they're much less specific about what a risk assessment should look like and what the requirements are. So the upside is that you have some leeway into how you approach that. The downside is it can create some insecurity about what you're supposed to do, but they're pretty open-ended. If you look at something like PCI or HIPAA, those are most focused on scope. So for example, PCI cares a lot about your card data environment. So where does card data live? So you could do tons of risk assessments, but if you miss a risk assessment around your card data environment, PCI will note that as a gap. So the most important thing for PCI is to consider the assets, the data, the technology related to that specific scope. HIPAA is similar in that way, that HIPAA risk analysis cares that you're doing risk assessments against the environments that could have PHI or health data in it. So just like PCI, you could do risk assessments all over the place, but if you're not considering specifically the technology threats, vulnerabilities of your healthcare environment, then that could be a gap. So I would say, generally speaking, the biggest component is the level of specificity that the different frameworks require. And among that specificity is the scope. Make sure that you're doing a risk assessment over the scope that is appropriate for that framework. So those are some of the biggest differences, Kendall.
Awesome. We had one come in as well that you may have partially answered, but maybe we can dive a little bit deeper around larger organizations. And so when looking at risk remediation, do you tend to see larger organizations include members from like a product or a project management office at the organizational level? And just any advice around multi-business unit, multi-product?
Yeah, so we at Risk 360, we have a lot of clients that are large enterprises, and what that looks like most often is there's a corporate entity, and that corporate entity might be shared services like shared IT, maybe security as a shared service, procurement, HR, and then there's business units. So maybe they have a North American business unit, an Asian business unit, a healthcare business unit, however that's organized. And then within those business units, often they have products, and sometimes they have multiple products. So business unit A may have 3 different products, business unit B has 1 product, so on and so forth. My point is there's a lot of layers in those types of organizations. So for one, there's a risk assessment done. Often that's done at the business unit level. And then each business unit has various projects going on to meet compliance requirements. And I see it handled 2 ways. Way number 1 is that there's a project management office at the corporate level that supports project management of all of those key initiatives and helps track them. So if you're a security company, if you're a security organization, maybe you need to engage your project management office. Option 2 that I see most common is that there is a project manager at the business unit level that you need to engage. So let's say there's business units A, B, and C, but you live at security that's at corporate. You may have 3 different points of contact at each business unit that will help you drive action for those different projects. I've also seen it much more decentralized, but that's the most common thing. I think the rule of thumb is if you don't have a project manager that for every project that you're doing, and that project manager doesn't have the appropriate influence and authority, that's probably a gap. And so you should consider who you need to engage to get the support you need to make that happen. Great, Kendall. Any other questions, Kendall?
Yeah, we had one around operational versus technology risks. And I guess maybe different classifications of risk. You know, how do you define what's technology versus operational, and could there be some crossover there?
Yeah, there's certainly crossover. Risk assessment is a very wide term. Mostly what I'm talking about here is security risks. So I would consider that as the context of everything I just said in this whole talk. But at most organizations, there's a risk management organization. And if you're part of the GRC program, you could be thinking about risk that aren't just security risk. So common risk, or for example, operational risk, maybe there's single points of failure amongst your leadership team in a certain department. And if that person went away, you'd be significantly impaired. Maybe you have currency conversion risk where you're operating globally and you currently use US as a basis of currency, but because of inflation, it's impairing your ability to do business in China. There could even be supply chain issues where you have a certain part that you can't get from a certain company for whatever reason. So those are a mix of strategic and operational risk that you may also be considering. For the most part, frameworks like SOC 2 and ISO and others that are doing, they're not concerned with those types of risks. They're more concerned with the security specific risk. So if you're tackling a framework or you're charged with a program that does SOC 2, ISO, and others, and that's the security universe, I think it's fair to say that you should limit your scope of how you're thinking for the purposes of those frameworks to security related risks, and then table the operational and the technology risks for a different conversation. And the way that we handle that at Risk 360 is our risk register tool, our Phalanx that has a risk register tool. You can create multiple risk registers and you can create tags and categories. And we tend to tag operational and technology risks separately from our security risk. And then even amongst security risks, you can have different classifications. So you might have a technology risk that is aging infrastructure, or you might have an operational risk that is a failure in process. So there is a, if you go to, I'll point you to 2 resources. ISO 27005, I think it's one of the annexes of that framework. They give you a whole catalog of risk categories. So if you're looking for just a good way to categorize and tag your risks, go to ISO 27005, look at the annex of that. The other one that I'll point you to is NIST 830. They also have a catalog and naming convention for different types of risk, like operational, technology, asset risk. And I think those are 2 really good normative standards that's well adopted, that if you're looking for like a tagging scheme and how to think about risk, you could leverage as authoritative guidance.
Awesome, thank you, Christian. Last question we had was, how can we get Risk 360 involved in our own risk management program?
Yeah, so if you want to learn more about Risk 360 or you'd like to work with us, I'll point you to 2 things. One is our YouTube channel, which you're probably watching this on. Check that out. We have so many great videos on risk management or on framework specific topics. It's really a whole education in itself. So subscribe to that, check it out. If you actually need some help with the program, you can go to risk360.com and click the Contact Us button, fill out that form, and we'll reach out to you very promptly and begin a conversation about your challenges. And then if you want to connect with me, just go to LinkedIn and then go look up Christian Hyatt and connect with me. I love connecting with people. I post a lot of content, try to engage everyone. So that's another great way.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Christian. That was really valuable. To everyone that attended, thank you so much. And yeah, once again, if you do have any questions, if you want to reach out to Risk 360, you can visit our website and contact us from there.